eyes, you know, and mirrors are no better. Cheaters never win, they say. They leave your heart in fetters. Beauty's only skin deep, they say. Eye of the beholder. But angels seem to spend their time looking over their shoulder. Everybody wants to disappear. Everybody wants to fly. They say anyone can find their wings. Yes, I close my eyes and feel for mine. Can't run away from who I am. Can't keep my pride and hang my head. Can't change the world to match my inside. Stop on a dime and change my ways. Walk through the walls out of this maze. Got nothing left to lose and everything to gain. It's time I find myself. It's time I find myself. It's time
Dear History, this is the first of many letters I plan to write, but I thought I would start with you since, if you're not correct, all the others seem moot. And I think there's a serious deficiency in how we view you. What I mean by that is that there's a lack of serious consideration given to the importance and prescient nature of comic books when it comes to predicting and driving social progress. Both in the ways that they reflect the issues of the time and how they ask us to be better, comics are a far too often overlooked mover of opinion toward a more open, more aware society. Let me explain. The use of comics to promote a more progressive society can be traced back to the golden age of comics that covered most of the 30s, 40s, and early 50s until 1954. Note to self: write a letter explaining the ages of comics. Most often, the thought is that these comics were corny adventures, serving up formulaic plots where the good guys swoop in on cartoonishly evil villains with transparent motives, display some amazing superpowers, and win the day. A handful of pages, plot over, repeat next month. Kind of like everybody's favorite scene from Firefly. You know the one.
Curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal. Mine is an evil laugh. Now die!
In some cases, this is correct, but there are two major things to understand about the Golden Age that demonstrate why even these comic books were pushing the envelope. The first thing to realize is that your grandparents were not nearly as repressed and puritanical as you seem to think they were. Neither were the Puritans, really, but that's a different subject altogether. But the young people of the early part of the 20th century weren't actually that different from the young people of today. They liked to party. They liked sex. They liked booze and adventure and thought they were invincible just like you did in your youth, and maybe still do. You're welcome. This was just after the Roaring Twenties, time of speakeasies and bathtub gin, and colored music. So immediately get out of your head that they were not interested in seeing sex, violence, and hard-hitting action in their entertainment. One of the reasons why you see so many biblical stories on film from the era is because it was an easy excuse to add sex and violence to media while maintaining an aura of respectability. And guess what? Adjusted for age, they liked similarly transgressive stuff as kids. But they, like you, also had parents who needed to maintain a sense of authority over their children and wring their hands over the fate of kids. They grew up, recognized that they made mistakes, and did their best to not let their kids make the same ones. So creators who wanted to bring across anti-establishment, anti-patriarchal, or pro-immigrant sentiment had to contend not only with the fact that they were dealing with children as a main audience and needed to present ideas in a way that they could understand, but bank on the hope that parents wouldn't really notice what was implied by what they were seeing. Which leads us to the second thing to understand about the Golden Age. Often messages had to be hidden and implied in the art rather than outright stated, what we call coded. Coding was usually done as a nod to those who could recognize it, a show of support that lessened the risk of exposure and the shutting down of the message. Coding can be used positively or negatively, either by attributing characteristics or items associated with a group to a hero or villain. Get it? Coding? Making villains slightly effeminate males or clearly sexually interested in other men, for example, is often the use of negative coding to imply that they were gay and therefore more evil. A good example is Baron Harkonnen in the Dune series, whose coded homosexuality is designed to reflect his narcissism and love of self. because that's totally how that works. Positive coding, on the other hand, is probably best seen in Superman. Keep in mind that the period in which Action Comics was first coming out were highly xenophobic and anti-Semitic. So what were two young Jewish immigrants to do in creating a hero that reflects their understanding of the world and presents a positive perspective on people like them? Make him officially Christian, like most of the country they're writing in, but code him as Jewish. Instead of working with negative stereotypes, like giving him an oversized nose or something ridiculous, they made his story mirror the Moses one of a child being sent from his parents to be raised in another home where he would be given great power. This also served double duty of making him an immigrant, yet also a savior figure. There's coding in the names as well. Kal-El is very close to Kol-El, the Hebrew transliteration of the voice of God, an obvious reference to Moses. The name Kent is an early 20th century Americanization of Cohen, and Clark's adopted grandfather's first name was Hiram. The suffix man is also common among Yiddish names like Edelman, Eisenman, Goldman, and especially Ullman, which was the birth name of Douglas Fairbanks, who Superman's looks were inspired by. Think about it. Batman aside, how many Golden Age heroes can you think of that had names ending in man? Similarly, coding was used by unabashed feminist and likely polyamorous Wonder Woman creator William Moulton Marston, a psychologist and inventor. Marston lived with his wife Elizabeth Holloway Marston, who helped him invent the systolic blood pressure test used in polygraph machines. Lasso of truth, huh? And a woman named Olive Byrne, who was often rumored to be the lover of both. The Wonder Woman creator and early scribe firmly believed not only in women's equality, but also in female superiority, believing women in general to be more trustworthy and intelligent than men. Further, he was an early critic of what was then the nascent men's rights movement, suggesting that concerns like the elimination of alimony payments that favored female spouses in a divorce could only be achieved once we've created a system where they would be capable of earning at the level of men should they no longer have a husband to support them. Further, he believed that women should be allowed to love and have sex even within marriage freely. Many of these attitudes are reflected in Wonder Woman, a female superhero from society run entirely by women on a place called Paradise Island. Wonder Woman as a character is prevented from settling down with one man by Aphrodite, who threatens to take her powers from her if she ever allows herself to be dominated or chained by somebody else, which monogamous marriage is often depicted as in the comic. The superior, even utopian quality of Paradise Island reflects his opinions on what he believed a matriarchal society would be like. Another thing is that Wonder Woman is unquestionably a sexual being, and quite kinky for the time. While she's attracted to Steve Trevor, she doesn't let that restrict her from being attracted to other men and women alike. Early in the run, she has her knee-length skirts switched out for tight-fitting shorts since they would be more practical, regardless of the expectations of her gender, and she's incredibly comfortable in her body. Later writers toned down Diana's sexuality, but during the Marston run, she was unashamed about her desires, and it shows. Of course, not everything was ahead of its time. Yeah. This may be one of the worst pages I have ever read. There is nothing good about this page. Also, Golden Age Green Lantern was apparently gay. No, not that one. No, not him either. I wish. No, it's this guy, Alan Scott. Let's be fair, though. This was retconned with the introduction of the New 52, so DC could prove they were so very progressive and get some free press out of the announcements. Maybe? These are just a few examples of a trend that ran throughout the Golden Age. It didn't just apply to Cape Comics either. Other genres approached sex, feminism, immigration, and similar contentious topics by couching their images and writing in codes that spoke to children and adults and gave them approval to adopt more permissive attitudes. The Silver and Bronze Ages brought us a lot more in terms of comics directly clashing with the status quo and pushing for a more inclusive society, but also addressing important issues. What we saw during these periods was a move away from coding and into direct confrontation of the issues of the day, sometimes trying to present a balanced view, but often taking a side. Perhaps the most famous of these is the introduction of the X-Men in 1963. Partially inspired by the Civil Rights Movement, the X-Men became a fairly obvious metaphor for the plight of African Americans in that they were people who were born different from the vast majority in some respect and, as a result, inspire hatred and fear. However, creator Stan Lee took that and made them into heroes, protecting even the people who would reject them from society. To quote Lee in an interview done in The Guardian in 2000, "I couldn't have everybody bitten by a radioactive spider or zapped with gamma rays, and it occurred to me that if I just said that they were mutants, that would make it easy. Then it occurred to me that instead of them just being heroes that everybody admired, what if I made other people fear and suspect and actually hate them because they were different? I loved that idea. It not only made them different, but it was a good metaphor for what was happening with the civil rights movement in the country at that time." Yeah, I do a bad Stan Lee. I'm sorry. I'll never do it again. It's also fairly easy to see the Martin Luther King-Malcolm X dichotomy between Professor Xavier and Magneto, which makes the naming convention a little strange there. Professor Xavier is often referred to as Professor X, which bears a striking resemblance to the habit of members of the Nation of Islam to replace their last names with X to represent their lost original names, most famously done by Malcolm X. That being said, most of Professor X's techniques more closely represent the civil disobedience and non-violent methods advocated by other civil rights leaders of the time. But metaphor can only take you so far. What many people don't realize is that civil disobedience techniques were taught not through a letter or essay, but through a comic book. At the beginning of the movement as a force, it was important to be able to teach leaders spread around the country the most effective ways to use nonviolent protests to achieve results, and the way that was done was through the publication of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story in 1957. This comic book was traded and passed around during the most tumultuous times as an instruction manual for how to actually do the things that King had used to such great effect in Alabama. It explained the Montgomery method in detail and inspired now Congressman John Lewis to not only become a leader of the civil rights movement, but also to write his own comic book, March, which explains that time and the fight for equality for racial minorities since through Lewis's own experiences. Silver Age was also when Marvel introduced the first black and Hispanic superheroes in the people of Black Panther and Fantastic Four number 52 and 53, and White Tiger in the compilation book Deadly Hands of Kung Fu. These were on top of the first Asian superhero, Mauve Bobcat, introduced years earlier. Okay, I made that last one up. Panther was unique in that he was not only a black character, he was not African American. He was African, leader of the nation of Wakanda, which was presented not as backward or barbaric, but rather as an enlightened and technologically advanced society. T'Challa was regal, wise, and fought by necessity. Similarly, White Tiger was also portrayed not as a street tough, though his stories mirrored the gang wars style of other books like Daredevil. Hector Ayala was a deeply thoughtful man, concerned for the people around him and mired in his culture. Of the two, only Panther took off and got his own book, going by the name Black Leopard for a while to disconnect from associations with the Black Panther Party, which had been formed a year after the superhero was introduced, but both play a part in the Marvel Universe today. T'Challa is still the leader of Wakanda, and while Hector Ayala is dead, his sister Ava has the gems that granted his power and is currently running with the Mighty Avengers at the time of this letter. Also, she stands up to tiger gods and makes them do what she wants, because badass. In the late 60s, comics were getting more direct and less coded. Another famous example is Amazing Spider-Man number 96 through 98. In it, Stan Lee wanted to tell a story about drug addiction. It was fairly simplistic at the time, involving both Harry Osborn and another random kid becoming addicted to pills, and Spider-Man having to rescue the latter while the former starts along his path that would eventually lead him to becoming the second Green Goblin. But Lee ran into a problem. The Comics Code Authority, an industry group that was formed to self-censor so that the government wouldn't step in and do so itself, had very strict rules on what could be shown in comic books, and drug use was not allowed. Even if the subject was that drug use was bad and dangerous, the CCA would not allow Lee to publish that story and receive the seal that they put on approved books. It doesn't seem like much today, but like MPAA ratings on movies, parents paid attention for that seal and often wouldn't buy books for their kids that didn't have it. Lee was taking a huge financial risk publishing without the CCA seal, but he felt the story was too important and they went to press anyway. This both made a statement about the dangers of drug abuse and the importance of standing up to even authorities to do the right thing, an message for most Cape Comics. While Marvel ruled the roost during the Silver Age when it came to addressing real problems in their books, DC kicked off the Bronze Age when they decided to take a stab at social awareness with Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams' Green Lantern and Green Arrow crossovers. The GLGA books were specifically designed to not only present real-life situations rather than have the heroes combating supervillains, but by taking the generally conservative, Law & Order space cop Hal Jordan and pairing him with Robin Hood-inspired libertine Oliver Queen, they could have the heroes themselves take opposite positions on many issues, introducing a level of nuance that was fairly rare until that point. Lantern and Arrow for most of the run traveled across America together, a couple of best friends trying to find simple answers to complex questions, and ultimately realizing there are no simple answers. They addressed workers' rights, native rights, drug abuse, environmentalism, and a whole host of other things. While I personally don't like superheroes fighting one another, when they clashed it was more often in the vein of arguments between friends, usually not escalating further than a fistfight. This is also the run that introduced John Stewart, the first Black Green Lantern, and we get a chance to see his neighborhood and how even a decade after the Civil Rights Act, full equality hadn't been reached. Similarly, this is the run where Ollie finds out that Roy Harper, his sidekick and ward, had become addicted to heroin, because Ollie is a selfish jerk only concerned with resolving his existential angst by driving around the country with his bestie instead of taking care of the underage kid he agreed to take care of. Seriously, Ollie, don't be proud that the kid managed to rise above you being an asshole. Again, these are just a few examples, but comics during this time period were moving out of trying to hide their messages, and instead making every effort to directly guide the young minds that were consuming their work. There was one comic that was pretty consistently ahead of the curve. Archie Andrews was first introduced in Pep Comics in 1941, the same year as Wonder Woman, and since then has been addressing social change by modeling a place where it is natural for these positive changes to occur. Riverdale is designed as an idealized community, one where even the arrival of the Punisher, yeah, that really happened, is fairly lighthearted and blood-free. Rather than the in-your-face approach of the O'Neil-Adams GLGA run, Archie books have addressed social change by just making the changes happen in Riverdale and portraying them as a normal, everyday part of living in that town. First, looking at Archie as a character, yes, he's defined in many ways by how girl-crazy he is, dating 2 girls regularly and several others occasionally as time and plot allows.
Archie and Jughead were lovers.
What is interesting, though, is how this is treated. He's not socially rewarded or punished for his dating, but rather it's considered a part of who he is. Rather than gaining social capital, as men often do in the real world, Archie is more known for his clumsiness or kindness than his dating life. It's important here to mention that his steady paramours, Betty and Veronica, are granted a similar pass in this respect, only from the opposite end. In general, they continue to date as well without the risk of being slut-shamed for doing so. While they clearly love Archie and want to spend time with him, their social lives are not reliant on the titular redhead, and they are not punished for pursuing other options while he's off dating another party. More to the point, their friendship is not broken or even excessively strained by their competition over Archie's affections, and there have been several times when they have chosen their friendship over Archie's attention, again stressing that their attraction to him is not the sole defining pursuit of their lives. Betty and Veronica themselves are possibly the least one-note characters of a fairly flat cast. Don't get me wrong, I love Archie, but I bear no illusions that these are deep or dynamic characters. They generally have a couple of defining traits that guide their behavior, such as Archie being nice and obsessed with girls,
Deny.
Jughead loving to eat, Reggie being kind of a jerk, etc. But Betty and Veronica have a much wider range of traits to draw from. Betty is athletic, passionate, an activist, a baker, openly feminist, and the most trustworthy of the Riverdale gang. Veronica has a few more negative traits, such as her narcissism and temper, but they serve to round out a character who is otherwise endlessly generous, clever, confident, and smart. Both are highly independent, not only of others, but of one another, not just being the same character with different hair. There's a pretty obvious feminist streak that runs through the comic, despite the title character being who he is. When female characters are portrayed, they are neither incapable nor placed on a pedestal. And sometimes they'll be able to address issues directly, like this one-pager from Betty and Veronica number 326, published in October of 1983, illustrating the double standards held for men and women for the same behavior. Similarly, Archie Comics broke ground when they introduced openly gay character Kevin Keller to Riverdale in Veronica number 202. Keller was an immediate hit, both in the comic and out of it. Again, in the way that Riverdale models good behaviors, homosexuality is not an issue except in that Veronica doesn't realize that he doesn't want to date her, and Jughead doesn't mention he's gay because he finds it funny that she keeps throwing herself at him. Keller's not defined by his sexual orientation, gaining more popularity for being able to eat as much as Juggy. He has relationships filled with the same hilarious foibles as his straight friends, has a military father who loves him unfailingly, and when he's nervous about kissing his boyfriend for the first time, it's because it's their first kiss, not that it's a boy. In Life with Archie number 16, their series set in the future to explore various what-if situations, he gets married while in uniform to his African-American partner. Sure, he deals with anti-gay bullying at times, but again, the message we're given is that when bullies rise up, it's the responsibility of everybody to put them down. This is not to say that Archie comics have always been ahead of the curve on all things. Their treatment of people of other races besides white has only recently become better. For the longest time, Riverdale was pretty lily white, and when they started introducing black characters, those characters were often colored as light as possible. At least two characters, Dexter and Brandon, were recolored white or very light when it became clear that they would be love interests for Betty or Veronica, or even Cheryl Blossom. And when non-white characters are introduced, it's often in pairs, like Chuck and Nancy, so that they can date one another and not the white girls. However, this is changing quite a bit. The introduction of Ginger Lopez is a step in the right direction, as well as more starring roles for Chuck Clayton. We also see Archie dating Valerie Brown from Josie and the Pussycats, and even a Life with Archie dedicated to them having a child together, though it's still a far step from letting one of the girls date a black or Hispanic guy. The cultural makeup of Riverdale is increasing, and it's good to see that these characters are not defined by racial stereotypes, so they're making steps in the right direction at least. Similarly, the relationship between Moose and Midge is fairly problematic. Moose's jealousy and possessiveness are really unsettling, and the way that he immediately goes to violence is incredibly disturbing. While his violence is aimed at others and not at Midge herself, that doesn't make it right that any guy who talks to her has to worry about being beaten up, nor is it a good idea that their short-lived breakup is the result of her dating somebody behind his back, thereby confirming his fears. I think it's important for Archie Comics to deal with this. That all being said, Archie Comics have created a laboratory where they can explore ideologies by simply modeling them, and as a result, they've been ahead of the game on a lot of issues. Suffice it to say, History, there is a lot there to work with, yet I haven't seen even one of your mainstream books discussing this. Comic books are an important part of how we've developed as people, and I think it bears mentioning. There was never a point in time when comics were just for kids. Even when they were the target audience, comics were for our future, with a view toward making us better people. Sequentially yours, Karu.
As long as I can remember, I haven't looked for you. I haven't looked for you all my days. As long as I can remember, I haven't looked for you. And all this while you were waiting along the way. So let this be a testimony of how far I would go to bring you home. And let each day be our victory and the sweetest time that we've ever known. Quédate, por favor, por favor, quédate conmigo. Останься, пожалуйста, пожалуйста, останься со мной. No.